Filigree, it's easier than you think. When I started doing filigree, when he showed me, I had never even handled a torch before. And you'll see in the next slide, these are the first pieces I ever made. It's basically 3 different shapes I used. This little main shape that's used here, I call a lima bean shape. It's one of the more difficult ones to make at first because you have to get used to making it symmetrical, and it's not always easy. And there's these little teardrops. And this one is 2 spirals, but pointing out. In my book, I call that a witch's hat. I just had to make up some kind of name to explain it. Now, this is the first torch I learned on, which was Bjorn's dad's, my husband's dad's. And it is propane, but it has a blowpipe for air. I don't want to use that anymore. It's also broken, but it's I definitely prefer current technology. The Norwegians, each district has their own what they call national costume, which they will wear for special events, especially their national day, which is the 17th of May, but also weddings and other special events, confirmations are a big deal in the churches there. And each one has its own costume, its own specific embroidery, its own specific jewelry that goes with it. And these are some examples of what they call bunadssølv or sølje. Very often they're symmetrical on a it's on a what do you call it, circular pattern, repeated pattern. That would make me absolutely stark raving bonkers to have to do. So I just kind of took the technique and ran with it. The next one, these are some other examples of filigree from around the world. Oops. It's made in many, many countries. The US is one of the few that doesn't really have a tradition for it. It can be labor intensive. These pieces here, 13, 14, 15, 16, and 19, and I believe 18. I'm not, well, I think they all may be from Lisa, a friend of mine in Pennsylvania, who learned her filigree work from a woman in Atlanta whose focus is Russian filigree. And one of the differences is that the filigree becomes much more of a filler, where mine, the filigree is the structure. And you'll see more when I show you the designs. Polynesian filigree beads and findings. I'm not sure. Let's see. Yes, this is also Bali. All of these are Bali. This one is Malaysian and it's 3-dimensional. Same here, Malaysia. This is a Mexican one. This is a huge brooch. It's probably about 2.5 inches across, maybe 3. And it's all 3-dimensional. But again, all of these here, the filigree fills the piece, the design. Here's some Egyptian and Israeli filigree. This last piece on this page, a friend of mine in Portland did years ago. Same effect, he gets the scroll work, but with the opposite technique. He actually does pierce work, where he cuts away silver to get the same kind of scroll work. Some other examples, India, Portuguese often do it in silver, but then gild parts of it. Very intricate work, very fine wires. And most filigree like this is done in fine silver, so 999. Let's see. This one is from Morocco. A couple from Africa. You can see filigree done in 3 dimensions, especially in India. They do a lot of big pieces. sculptural pieces in filigree. This was a spoon that I got at a flea market in England. But you can see some of the same patterns as in the first pieces I did. As I said, filigree wire is often made with fine silver or high carat gold because it's so flexible. However, it's not always as durable. Now, the Norwegian filigree uses either 925 sterling or 830, which is closer to coin silver. The wires in Norwegian filigree are generally heavier than many of the more common techniques, which makes it a little bit more durable for everyday wear. Some filigree in other places like Russia sometimes is done in copper and then silver plated. As I mentioned, in Portugal, they often use the fine silver, but then gold plate it. Excuse my cat here. Luke, go away. And some places use, like in India, use a generic white metal. Filigree wire is generally a patterned flat wire. You can do it without that. You can use regular wire, but traditional filigree is a patterned, like a twisted, excuse me. He thinks it's snack time because he hears me talking. So he's like, oh, okay, she's awake. Anyway, there are several ways you can make this pattern wire. In Norway, they mass produce it by drawing it through a type of screw thread die. Like if you're going to have the screw pattern on the back of a sterling silver screw back earring. So it basically shapes it into a screw pattern and then they roll it flat. Now, that's not something that's so easy for you and I to do, for example. You can buy thinly patterned twist wire and flatten it yourself. The simplest way to make it yourself, which I'll show in the next slide, is by twisting 2 strands of thin wire as tightly as possible and then flattening it. I usually use 24 gauge if I make my own, but you can play with it heavier or finer. Also, if you don't feel like making it at all, Rio Grande does still sell the finished filigree wire, and that's the order number. I can write it down or send that to you, Rick, if you need it. But they do carry it. So this is an example of homemade wire. You can see some of the other examples depending on how tightly you twist it. This one here is the first one is the Norwegian wire, so it's a much tighter wire. This is Rio's version. And over here is the example of how you make it. Now, if you do this, you need to make sure you use eye protection because when you stretch out the wire from a vise to either a hand drill or something like a Dremel, it reaches a point where it will often snap on the end with the vise. And you don't want to have that come back and hit you. But you place the loose ends of a doubled over strand in a vise and then the other end into a drill, and you roll it as tight as you can, often until it snaps. If it's not tight enough, you may have to anneal it, which is heating it to make it softer, and then pickling it, which is putting it in an acid to take off the oxidation, and repeat the above procedure until you get it fairly tight. Then you can roll it through a rolling mill if you have it. If you don't, and this is what I meant to add here, and of course I forgot, there are a couple of options. You can hammer it very gently and evenly. But one of my readers actually told me, and I've tried it since and it works, metal pasta mills, which look like a rolling mill, are strong enough to give you a flattened filigree wire. So keep an eye out at Goodwill because they show up a lot. Just make sure the handle is there because most of the time it's not.
Oh,
So anyway, you can, if you don't have a rolling mill, but you want to try that, that's probably one of your best options. It's cheapest too, especially if you can get it at a thrift store. This is my original torch here. It's an oxygen, not oxygen, it's a propane air torch, hardware torch with a hose on it. The original one, I can't remember if it was a pinpoint or a pencil point tip, but it's a small tip. Now, I have more on torches in the next slide because they got difficult to find for a while. Your basic tools you're going to need are a round-nosed pliers, preferably fine-tipped, and some kind of flat ones. But in other words, otherwise your general tools. I just bought this torch before New Year's, and I finally got to try it for this demo. And I really like it. For a while, the handheld propane and air torches disappeared from the market because everybody was using these guys, which are the butane handheld torches. You can use those too, especially for smaller pieces, but if you start doing bigger pieces with larger stones, for example, you're going to want probably a propane and air torch. Some might wonder why not a propane oxygen propane or oxygen acetylene. You can try it, but the flame is a bit small. And often if you're going to be soldering several joints at once, you have to heat the whole piece. And that's harder to do with the finer flames from the oxypropane and oxyacetylene jeweler's torches. Let's see. By the way, I really do like this torch after using it. It has an adjustable flame from fairly small to quite large, which is nice in case you are working on everything from small pieces up to your bigger bezel settings where you need the bigger flame. You don't have to change tips or anything. You just adjust the knob on the top and that gives you a bigger flame.
what's the name of that?
The torch is a fire point. It's put out by Burns-O-Matic. They call it a creator tool or creator torch or something like that, but it's a fire point. It runs around $70, give or take a few dollars, depending on where you find it. I found it on sale. I think it was actually in November at Lowe's, but I'd have to check the prices again. I just know that they're about 70, give or take. These torches here, you can get them for anywhere from about $10 at Harbor Freight, though I'm not sure what the quality is, to around 30 to 50 for more expensive models. So, other tools, you'll definitely need some kind of side cutters or clippers, shears for cutting sheet solder. I highly recommend these self-locking soldering tweezers. A fine tipped tweezer of some type for picking up bits of solder. This tool is invaluable. It is a solder pick. There are two ways to put the solder on the filigree. You can either lay it on the joint or on several joints and heat it, but sometimes they blow away when the burst of gas hits it, the flame. So this little gadget here, the solder pick, is very good for picking up solder and putting exactly where you want it. You will want some kind of basic files. These are diamond files from Harbor Freight. Some kind of flex shaft or Dremel is definitely a good idea. And just general tools. This is a homemade tool that can come in handy, especially if you're making a piece that needs several of the same size pieces. And this will, I'll have a demo in the next frame that will show how to do this, or in one of the next frames. But you can make it with any piece of sheet metal. This was either a piece, I think this was a piece of brass. And it's just cutting in at certain distances, maybe centimeter, an inch, it's up to you. And you bend it around that. So it's a jig of sorts. And it lets you cut a whole bunch at the same size. Okay, it's a couple screens away yet. This is how I keep my bench set up. You have your soldering area, a board or a fire brick. I have acid, which is your pickle, they call it, and water. Now you can use commercial pickles such as Sparax, Rio pickle. They're basically a sulfuric acid based solution, but somebody else tipped me off to something that's easier to get, cheaper, and safer. That's swimming pool chemicals. It's basically the same chemical. It's a sulfur based material in it, and it's not as dangerous to use. With the filigree, because you're going to be doing so many joints, you quench it while it's still hot in the pickle and then rinse it and then bring it back. Otherwise, a lot of times when you're doing silver work, you might put it in cold pickle and let it sit for a while. But if you have, say, 50 joints to solder, that's going to take you forever. So if you put it in hot, it removes the oxidation faster. In the rinse water, I often put in a little bit of baking soda to neutralize it. Your solder, I use sheet solder that I cut into small chips. I don't like using wire solder, because since it's round, it will roll off if you cut small pieces. If you try to use the whole wire and just put a little bit, you end up with a large clump on it. Paste solder you could try, but I end up moving my little pieces, so it's harder to do that, to wipe it off and put it on. Some filigree is done using a powdered solder. I have not tried this. The woman who teaches the Russian version, I believe, sells it. Some people swear by it. This is how I learned, was with small chips. And you'll end up cutting strips like this and then cross cutting. And it helps to hold your finger over the end of this when you're cutting, so that the chips don't fly everywhere. Shaping the filigree. To shape your filigree components, you'll mostly be using your round nose pliers, but you're not actually doing the shaping with the pliers themselves. You essentially grab the end of the wire and make your starter loop here, but then you're going to use your fingers and the tension of the wire itself to make a smooth curve. And I will be demonstrating that. Here's an example. You grip it with the tips, and then you're going to shape it with your fingers. You hold it essentially with your pliers and then use your fingers to bring it back and around. And that should be where I have the demo in a second. Yes. Sorry, some of this came out a little blurry. I had to video it myself, but you'll get the idea.
So this
Are
is
you
the
getting the
tool that I
sound?
showed you in the slideshow. It's
Yes.
a bit tarnished because it's old. But what you can do is you can use that to make multiple pieces the same length by essentially bending it like that. And then taking your cutters and just clipping them at the joints.
You may want to straighten the end pieces where they're slightly bent before twisting them.
Ta-da! Now, the thing with shaping the filigree, no matter which shape you're going to make, whether it's just a straight curve or lima bean shape or heart shape or whatever you want to do, is using the tips of your round nose pliers, making your beginning loop, and then use your fingers and the tension of the wire and drag the back around. You're basically using the tips as an anchor point. And that gives you a nice, smooth curve. Now, it will take you some time to get practice and get the feel for it. But you can see it's a more even curve where if you force it, it's going to end up with irregular curves or even flat spots. So again, I take the tip and I wrap it around. Use your fingers to pull the wire around the back side. You're turning the pliers a little bit, just as a counterweight, but still most of the work is in your fingers. And if you're going to do something symmetrical, you may have to make some small adjustments to the pieces before you solder them. But you basically have two of the same shape now. Again.
You could also line them up against each other afterwards to do fine adjustments so that two pieces match.
Now you're not at all limited to single spirals. If I take a larger piece, for example, this one, and I bend it somewhere like this, I find that if I want to get a nice sharp edge, you can actually often take the inside of the pliers, actually this part on this pair, and that makes a nice sharp point. Then you could do a loop this way and this way, or you can do, for example, this way, and do the other one the same way. But again, you're primarily making your grip with the pliers and then using the shape or the tension of the wire to shape it. Sometimes you'll have to fudge it and go back and play with it, especially on the more complex pieces, because they don't always want to behave. But you can see now you have a double spiral.
Oops. Yeah. So you can get some ideas. You could do double spirals this way. You could do double spirals like this. You could do two different directions. You can do pieces like this. These give you examples of what you can do with it. This was actually from a template I was laying out on my computer at the time. So this shows, for example, 4 pieces together. That was more for designing. But you can get an idea of the variety of shapes you can make. It's really just limited by your imagination, what you can manage to make of it. Soldering your components together, there's 2 ways to do it. The way I initially learned was putting the solder chips out in several pieces. Now, and then heating it all at once, and they melt all together or right after each other. You do need to flux every time you're going to solder. I recommend a dispenser with some kind of needle-like tip so you can get precision. Excuse me. In my flux, I found adding a little bit of denatured alcohol to the mixture is an advantage. That was a tip a jeweler gave me once. What happens if you use just the straight liquid flux, when you heat it, it starts to boil and you get like a white boiling mess. That tends to spread pieces apart, the small pieces apart, and then you have trouble making that joint unless you shove it together again. If you add maybe up to 15–20% at most, what do you call it, denatured alcohol into your flux, then you can light it and most of the moisture disappears instantly. And that leaves the flux coating, but you don't have the boiling, so it doesn't displace. Now, putting the gran in filigree. Filigree, the word is filament and granule. That's where it comes from. The granules, I usually make it from scraps, so things that I've half melted or screwed up, cut off, whatever, and I'll make a lot of these little balls. I find doing it on a fire brick better than, for example, a charcoal block or one of the white soldering boards, because the stuff from the soldering boards or the charcoal blocks tend to flake off and stick to the backs. If you use a fire brick for this, it leaves the back smoother, as you can see in this picture, in the third picture. See? It's cleaner and it'll be easier. And you want that flat back because you're going to lay this on top of the pieces later over places where you've soldered multiple times or where multiple pieces connect to hide the solder joints. We have a demo here. It took a little while to do because I wasn't used to the torch. So I was having trouble finding that, what we call a sweet spot, which is that point where it is the perfect heat spot. I'm going to need to have some of the little granules for this. Normally I would use scrap or round wire or something, but I just had some of the filigree wire here and I'm going to use that this time. You should, whatever you're using, flux it. That'll make it flow easier. And then you light your torch. And you might want to keep your, what do you call it, your solder pick handy, which I couldn't find right at that moment. But we'll just do it this way. I'm going to start at one end. Increase this a bit. This one may flow into the other one, yeah. It was taking me a little longer than usual to get them to flow, because there's a specific point in the flame that makes it melt faster, and with a new torch it takes me a while to find that. There, that one went quickly.
I'm doing this one on the fire brick because it tends to make the back smoother and cleaner. And I'll often make a whole bunch of them, and then I can pick out the ones that I want for the actual project.
And that's
And
the
that
natured
flash
alcohol.
is because of the denatured alcohol that I add. So you definitely want to keep your face out of it when you do that.
You want to attach to hydraulics balance.
I am using a new torch, so it's taking a little bit of extra time to get the hot spot just right.
What I end up doing is pulling out the either a solder pick or the soldering tweezers and pick it up off the brick a little bit, which makes it melt faster.
Now, where did I put that? I'll use this. I've misplaced my soldering pick for the moment, but sometimes if it doesn't want to flow, you can just kind of move it with soldering tweezers or the pick, and that will
Basically, the brick is a heat sink.
I'm going to need to have some
Sorry.
of the little granules for this.
Sorry about that. I'm going to go ahead and skip to the next one. You get the idea. You will want to pickle them to get them cleaned up. This is the project itself. This is from my book. It's not the most beginner project. It's a nice beginner project that uses some different shapes. It's simple and it's versatile. You could use this design or a similar design for a faceted stone, a cabochon, or even a dangle in the middle. For example, a pearl or briolets. Most of the filigree I do is made up of a framework together with filigree components. Because the wire used in this style is heavier and usually sterling, it allows more open designs as opposed to, for example, the Russian style, which was more of a filler. The design itself is made up from the filigree in this rather than just being a filler. It will remain fairly soft until you polish it. Let's see. The basic design on this is a teardrop framework. And then you have two basic shapes that you repeat symmetrically. Now, as Lori mentioned, I hate doing symmetrical. Trying to get it exactly the same on both sides, it's just, I don't have the patience for it most of the time. So most of my work, which you'll see at the end, I have some other examples of my work, is very asymmetrical. This is from the book that shows the individual stages of it. Rick has a PDF of that. He'll send anybody who wants it, so you can try it yourself. I'm going to do a couple small variations in the actual demo. Instead of making this loop at the end, I'm going to make an easier organic bale, looking bale. And I am going to leave out this piece, and the bottom's a little different, but it's basically the same design. And this does take time because this is a time consuming process, but it's worth it for the effect that you get. as you'll see at the end, cleaning it up, this little steel brush is important, and you'll see that in the demo. And now I'm just going to play this, and I may interrupt every so often. Rick, if there's anything anybody really wonders about or has trouble with, flag me down and I'll stop,
Sure.
because this runs for a while.
Okay, now for the main demo. I'm going to warn you guys ahead of time, I am nowhere near as steady-handed or keen of sight as I once was, so I screw up a little bit more than usual, which is one reason for recording this ahead of time. I am going to do something very close to the teardrop one. I'm going to make a slight variation on it though. We're going to start by bending
This is
the
approximately
wire around something round to get.
This is approximately 18 gauge square wire. As you can see here, the end is just cut, so I will be filing that down.
Get the right shape, but I'm going to leave an extra bit at the top. This is going to simplify this when it comes to making a bail. Okay, it may not be perfect right now, perfectly shaped, but that's fine as long as they're meeting. And if you need to, go in and file a little bit
File it flat so that
so that it
fits
meets well.
better against it. I could be a little bit sloppy on this, but yeah, make it as flat as you can to make it
If
match
you
up.
go across like that and then back, it'll have a little bit of tension in the wire so it holds it in place.
Or it messes up, which you'll see in a minute. But it actually had too much tension and popped out of place.
I prefer using the solder pick because it tends to, those solder chips tend to blow around with the torch. The noise in the background, by the way, is the train tracks right behind my studio. I'm going to pick up a piece of solder. And I'm going to heat the whole piece.
That's where it popped out of place. But with
And
the
I'm gonna
solder
just drop
pick, we
that
can
in
fix
there and
that.
hook. And of course it went out of place.
You can just nudge it
There we
back
go.
into place.
That solder pick comes in handy. I will straighten this out off camera.
When pickling stuff, you want to use copper tongs or stainless steel. Otherwise, the pickle can eat away at the iron in regular tweezers.
So just straighten that out a little bit, and I'm going to bring that up like that. And then I'm going to try to make this a little bit more symmetrical. So now it looks like a tennis racket. Try to get it as flat as possible. And then I'm going to start adding the little spirals around the outside. Because I am not as steady as I once was, I'm only going to do 2 at a time. Because otherwise I tend to knock them loose.
What I would do when you're making these spirals is take 2 of them and line them up next to each other and make sure that they're pretty close fitting. But the way we're going to do this, you have some leeway to adjust it before you solder both ends on.
I would start with just the end piece up here, and then you can make small adjustments to make them more symmetrical. And there's a bit of solder there already, but I will bring some more in if needed.
Now the one on the right is a little bit loose, but it's nothing that you can't just nudge with the solder pick.
Every time you do that work, you need to quench it in the pickle to try to get rid of the tarnish.
At least
So
some
the
of
next ones you do are going to fit. Now here's what I'm doing is I am going over it now and adjusting to make
So-
them more symmetrical.
it. Right, so before you
Okay.
solder the
Once that is in
loop
place,
in place, you
I
want to
can
make it
take
as
another
symmetrical as
pair.
possible.
and line them up so we can try to solder them at the same time. But only the top pieces. We're going to do this again. Like I said, if you want to try it, you can take your solder chip and place it on the joint. But keep that pick handy because half the time it blows away or doesn't go exactly where you want it to go. It's a miracle.
It went right the first time.
That one did, and sometimes you have to remember that the solder will flow toward the heat. I would like a little bit more solder in there, so I'm going to pick up an additional bit.
It didn't completely fill on the lower part.
There we go, and we will grind that away afterwards. Again, we're going to quench it, rinse it, and as I said in the demo, I usually put a little bit of baking soda in the rinse water because it neutralizes the acid as you go.
That way you're not getting the acid on your fingers. Plus, any acid buildup that goes from the pickle and into the water is neutralized, so it doesn't build up.
Okay, now
Oops,
for
I
the main
missed.
demo.
Sorry about that. Okay. And now we're going to do the next set, same way as before.
Again, only worry about the end piece, getting that in to place. Flux. And I'm getting low on solder chips.
You see, I hold the end of it. That keeps them from flying in 20 different directions.
We'll try this again. But you see, here's the problem. I am a lot less steady-handed.
I wish
There
I
it
had
was.
my dexterity from 30 years ago.
Don't we all? Wisdom of today, but the dexterity.
See? Ta-da! That one actually did very well. Flux, or not flux, pickle, rinse, and you have it back here. I'm just take a pause for a second. All right. We're going to make sure this is where it's supposed to be. And touching there. And bring up 2 more little spirals and do the same thing.
I laid out the spirals as pairs ahead of time that were similar.
Now this one is sitting a little high, so when it comes time for this to solder, I will have to push it down a little bit. You want to at least warm the area, not just the one spot. And if you need to, bring it over like that so it'll flow. And here's the problem. That one's at a different level. There you go. There we go. Pickle, rinse. Line up your pieces again. Stretch this one out just a little bit. Now I'm going to go ahead and solder those two in place, and then I'm going to do something a little different than the book shows or the example shows. Now, the problem here is that I don't have enough room for another two of those. So I'm going to make a different shape to put down there. I'm going to take a piece like this. I'm going to cut it. Take my round nose pliers and split and bend it in two. I don't need that sharp spot on this one. I'm going to open it, and I'm going to bring in a loop that way.
It's a heart shape of sorts.
Turn it around and do the same thing with the other side.
You'll have to
And
fudge
we're
it
going to make a little heart.
to get it symmetrical at times. A little back and forth.
Just going to even this out a little. I don't really want to make that sharp point here because it will be a weak spot in this case. You see, now I have a heart, and we're going to put that in here, but we're going to make it a little smaller on the top so it'll fit.
A lot of this is done with your fingers, not necessarily with pliers. It's still not a perfect fit, so we're going to just solder it in there and use
That's actually
a bigger
good enough
ball
there.
in a
It can
minute, you'll
be
see.
out from it as long as it's symmetrical. We will just put a larger ball there. And again, I'm probably going to need my solder pick. And because this one is loose, it will heat up first. So you have to make sure you get, see? I almost melted it. There we go. There we go. Now we'll straighten that up. I'm going to heat up the whole thing so before I put it in the pickle, because that will speed up its cleanup. Doesn't have to be 100% white when you work on it, but the more of the oxidation you get rid of, the better.
It solders better without the oxidation there, so.
As you see, we've got a nice little shape now. The next stage, we're going to put some little loops in there, which I've made up.
Those tweezers were a bit bent, so that's why I was having trouble with it. I had to switch to a different pair.
Straighten that out.
There was a little bit of a bulge there, so I needed to make it flatter so it would fit better.
Sometimes, if you have a rolling mill at this point, you could lightly press it through the rolling mill to make it a little bit more even. But I just used my pliers for now.
As the pieces get smaller, I think my tweezers will get thinner too.
Believe me, I was using an Optivisor to do this.
Which type of solder are you using?
I was using hard. Let me pause this. You have usually hard, medium, easy, and sometimes you can get like a super easy. I try to use the hardest I can. As a beginner, I would suggest using medium or easy to learn on. But then as you get better with knowing when it's going to flow and stuff, I'd start with the hard as much as possible and work down, especially if you want to start doing more three-dimensional pieces. Then you're going to want to start with the hardest and then move to medium and easy.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
Mhm. Mhm. This one there's a bit of a difference on, so we're gonna
Much.
again use this to kind of even it out. It's not completely behaving, but we'll get it on the next round. So with this one, I'm going to just take this and push that there with the pliers. Sorry, you can't see it. I'm doing this self-videoing here. Okay. And we're going to pull up 3 more of these.
If you notice the loops, they overlap slightly instead of meeting specifically in the middle. This is to give it more of a point, so it fits better into the little V spaces.
Flux. And we're getting low on chips again. It does use a significant amount of solder, in case you hadn't noticed. And one of the reasons I use the chip solder, like I said, is it will lay on the flat joints. If you try to use, for example, cut up wire solder, it will roll off. Again, solder pick at the ready.
The reason I use my torch
That one did not
left-handed,
completely fill. So go over here, pick up another one.
the reason I use my torch left-handed is to free up my right hand for using tools, such as the solder pick.
Okay. The solder will flow toward the flame, so if it does that where it jumped over here, use the flame over here to pull it out. I'm going to put that in the acid and let it sit for a couple minutes because it's getting a bit gunky. So I'll be back. In the original design, I had a piece in the center. You can do that if you want. It's optional. It's more if you're going to try to connect a larger cab in the center and you need something to hold it, or if you want to have a dangle, for example, a briolette, you can hang it from that. I'm going to leave it like this for now. The next stage I'm going to do is putting these little balls in place. Now the balls are both decorative, but they also have the useful side effect of hiding sloppy solder joints, which in filigree you end up with quite a few of, just because of the way it works. So I'm going to try to match up balls that are similar size symmetrically. I'm not going to try to get them all exact because I just don't have them at the moment.
Often there's enough solder in those joints that you won't need to add additional. It'll just suck it up.
Hopefully, in most cases, you can use the solder that's already there. Unfortunately, as you see, it's not always easy to get them all in place. So we're going to go with these 4 first. Having that little bit of a flat backside just makes it easier to put it on there and have it stay. Oh, of course. Now it needs a boost. That one connected. This one I'm not so sure, so I'm going to take another piece of solder and just make sure. This one I'm going to need an additional piece because I want it to touch the solder there as well as down here.
Things do not always go as planned.
Nudge this guy.
Been doing it 35 years and things still don't go as they are supposed to at times.
Okay. Now those are all set. Pickle them. If any of them come off, you can always reattach them before you're done. But you can check, and they're all tightly in place. And now we'll do the other ones. I'm going to go ahead and actually flex it first. Doesn't have to be 100% perfect size match, but there. This guy's a little too rounded on the back. That's why it keeps rolling off. But there, we'll try that. And we're also going to want one up here. I'm going to go ahead and pick up a piece in case I need it. That one's going to adhere. This one, maybe. I'm going to go ahead and put a little bit more since it was being problematic. Gotta be careful because you see when it starts turning pink like that, it's about to melt. That one definitely adhered. We're going to nudge it though slightly. And that one adhered as well. So now all the balls are attached. Back in the pickle. Now when this is done, I will put a stone in it, a faceted stone. But this particular design gives you plenty of room to put whatever symmetrical stone you might want in it. I didn't bring one with me, so I'm not going to quite finish it. I'm just going to put in a finished setting. And sometimes it helps to do this in 2 stages.
I kind of made a mistake here. I shouldn't have put the solder on the setting first because of course the prongs are in the way. But often you can put the solder on a setting if you're going to have it adhere directly to it. It just makes it easier to make the solder jump from the smaller piece to the larger piece because of how the heat distribution and the heat sinks.
I am going to actually use my solder pick to pick up a larger piece of solder and adhere it to the setting. And then bring the setting over.
And then I realized that it wasn't going to
And
touch.
of course, it's not going to work because I need to do it at the
Prongs.
what do you call it? At the prongs instead. Sometimes it works better with bezel settings. But there we go. That is that. And then there's just one more thing we're going to do before we just clean it up a little bit. You see here how we have this piece extended at the end. I'm going to take this and hold it so it's sitting up. using some soldering locking tweezers. I'm going to flux that just a little bit. And I am going to, let's see, sometimes it helps to have something behind it to reflect the heat. I'm just going to heat this a little bit so that the end balls up.
It just makes it a nice finished smooth piece at the end instead of a sharper or squared off piece. Unfortunately, it took me a little longer than I planned to get it to melt, finding that perfect spot for the heat again.
This is taking a little longer than usual because it's a torch that I'm not used to.
There we go.
There we go. So finding that sweet spot in there is not so easy. What I'm going to do now, instead of putting on a jump ring, I'm going to grab this, bend it around, and make kind of an organic bail.
Want to make sure it's pushed
You
together
see this?
so they're touching.
I've got the softened end there. And again, we're going to take those pliers, not pliers, tweezers, locking tweezers, and hold it upright. And we're going to flux it. Pick up a nice little piece of solder. Heat up the top area. Try not to melt the filigree joints.
This would actually be a point where you might want to step down to medium solder here. I just didn't have it handy. But if you have all of this done with hard solder and then you do medium solder, you have less risk that you're going to melt the joints around it.
And just the point is to zip that together so that
Closes the loop.
it solders the loop closed. We're going to put that in the pickle for a few minutes, and then I will just do a quick rough cleanup. Okay, here it is, out of the acid, the pickle, and could have probably left it a little longer because there's still some darker spots. The first thing you want to do for cleaning it up, and most of the cleanup you're going to do on a flex shaft or a Dremel, is usually a Kratex type abrasive wheel, and just go along the parts that are going to be shining.
That takes out any nicks and also excess solder.
And clean up any of the solder clumps.
You may also want to go over the balls themselves if they're not very smooth. I did some of that today when I cleaned it up after setting the stone. I do the back side as well. If you have
You
any
do the back as well.
any joints which are a little bit rough or might scratch, you'll want to make sure that those are smoothed out. You do not want to use the Cratex on the pattern filigree wire or you will destroy the
I
pattern.
will be cleaning it up more after I set the stone.
And make small adjustments.
Just gonna straighten up a couple things here. So you see it's already looking a lot better. And then to get it clean of all this white stuff from the soldering, you want to use a steel brush.
Definitely use
Rotary
the steel.
brush.
If you use the brass brushes, then you get a gold sheen on your silver sometimes. So you definitely want to use the steel brush.
Please use eye protection. The little bristles tend to fly out, and you don't want one of those to get in your eye.
You go over the filigree wire with
And you
this.
just go over all of the nooks and crannies.
And any place that you need to get into, you're going to want to use the brush. Like in around the bail. Basically everywhere you didn't use the Cratex.
Both in the pattern and in the piece. As you can see now, you've got a basic shine on it. It's not finished. I will still need to set the stone and then do the proper polish on a regular polisher with, what do I use? It's not Tripoli, white diamond, and then polishing compound like a Zam or a Fabulister. But you can see now we have the basic piece finished. The difference from the design and that I am handing out from my book is that the bail is a one piece, not a jump ring. You can make it larger if you need to. It just gives you the basic idea. Now, I do not do a lot of symmetrical pieces anymore because I like asymmetry. It's more free flowing, but I also it drives me crazy trying to get the pieces even as possible. But as you can see, there it is. Just pop a stone in and set it, and then finish polishing it.
So,
Okay, now
why did it do that? There we go. So that is how it came out.
Mhm.
So I need to do a little bit more touch up. I noticed after I was done, there were a couple little spots I have to go back and just clean up. But it's all nice and shiny. Now, when you do polish this, I didn't film this part because it's another longer process. and it's hard to film when I'm polishing in that polisher. But if you're familiar with doing any jewelry work, you have bristle brushes that you use with an abrasive like Tripoli or white diamond. And you're going to want to use the bristle brushes on the whole thing first, but especially on the filigree pattern, because that's going to get in there and clean up all those little patterned sections. Then you're going to go to a buff, like a muslin buff with the same compound. But on that, you want to focus mostly on the shiny parts, because if you use too much pressure with a muslin buff on the filigree pattern, you're going to rip away the pattern. Once that's done, then you're going to want to clean it and then use a final polishing compound like Fabuluster or Zam on a clean muslin buff, or one that's used for just that compound. I'm just going to show you, like I said, I don't do a lot of those symmetrical pieces anymore. These are some of my other pieces. I often design on the fly, sitting at the bench, and just make a framework, know where I want the stone to be, and just build it until it feels right. So it's very intuitive. Some gem silica and turquoise and an opal doublet. I use both cabochons and faceted stones. I'm going to start using more cabs because I have cut so many nice cabs now that I have a stash that would probably make Lori there go completely bonkers if she ever actually saw my real stash.
Yeah,
But
I said, yeah.
Yep.
these pieces are actually cast, but I made the originals by hand. I ended up doing casting, especially for earrings, because I hate making two of the same thing over and over again. This is an example of a three-dimensional piece, and this is where using the different solders would be important, because you would start making the framework with a hard solder. That's the highest melting temperature. It has nothing to do with whether it's physically hard, medium, or soft, or easy. It's the flowing temperature. Because if you look at the side view, you have filigree on the back, and then this part over here is domed. So the main framework is done with a hard solder, and then the filler is done either with medium or easy. So I think that's the last. No, there's one more with just two more handmade pieces with cabs and faceted. And you can see I use this bale style quite a lot. It just makes it more organic feeling to me. I even used it in this. This one's a cast piece again, but I made the original by hand. And again, I have a organic bale.